Good day, everybody. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about organized labor and organized labor leadership in the crosshairs. How can labor unions play a more constructive role in organizational success? First, some perspective is important. Labor unions dominated the landscape in the early 20th century. From the years of 1920 to 1960, somewhere around those years, labor had a dominant role in our organizations, in our country. A number of reasons for that. First was the dramatic overemphasis of management organizations and their employers on profits, and the way that they degradingly charged and also managed their staff. So a number of laws were passed during this time that outlawed many of the really draconian efforts by management to control employees. Pay was increased. We saw that youth, children in fact, were no longer allowed to work, especially in some of the more manufacturing plants that weren't as safe. And we also saw, in addition to working conditions, that employees now had some voice in the way that an organization was run. All these are highly positive. And so during this time, you had some benefits of employees participating in the process. Additionally, what's important to remember is that this country and this world was going through two world wars. And especially after World War II, most of the other countries were decimated. When you think of Britain, France, and Germany, Austria, Italy, Russia, Japan, China, many of the countries that today are behemoths that really participate fully in the economics of the world that we have today, they were decimated. Their manufacturing prowesses were destroyed. And there really was one country that dominated after World War II, and that was the United States. At one time, we produced 2/3 of all of the machinery that was used during World War II. And after, we still had the opportunity, we had the ability to create these huge manufacturing industries with very little competition. During that time, it was very easy, or at least much easier, for management and owners to share some of this profit with employees. And so the unions that then represented these employees gained great power because they were able to offer and promote benefits to their employees. Management and their owners could also provide them. It was really a glory day for people who had a job after World War II. In fact, you could raise a family with just one income during this period. Starting in the 1970s, you really needed at least an income and a half, going towards two incomes. It was becoming increasingly difficult to have an acceptable standard of living in the 1970s. Part of that is that the economies changed. The Japans, the Chinas, the United Kingdoms, England, Germany, Russia had rebuilt their economies. They also often had lower standards of living and lower employee costs. So if you look back in the 70s and 80s, you'll see that the United States started to struggle. Unions started to struggle. Our high costs of wages and benefits meant that we no longer could compete, or at least we struggled to compete. And we see today that our manufacturing part of our economy has dropped considerably. We don't make as much as we used to. We're more into services, whether that's financial services or consumer services, as opposed to actually making stuff. The United States still designs many of the products that are used throughout the world. We just don't make them as much anymore. As a result, the workers that used to make these products are employed, at least in the same sectors that they used to. These sectors like automotive and other manufacturing, steel, the Rust Belt industries, many of them are struggling, and along with many of the people who used to work there. They go into the consumer-oriented jobs, and as a result, their wages are much less than they were some years ago. Instead of seeing benefits rise, or at least more people achieve benefits, we're seeing fewer people have benefits. In fact, most of us now have to pay for our own retirement. Some years ago, 30, 40 years ago, the employer paid for our benefits. That all has had repercussions on unions. Today, unions have about 7% of private sector employees. They have almost 40% of public sector employees. And so we see unions much more in the public sector than the private sector. So unions have struggled. What can unions do to address this struggle? First thing they can do is recognize that the industry, the world, has changed. We need a much more cooperative relationship with management. It's no longer adversarial. Unions and their managements and their unions, and also owners need to have a collective voice in how to address the situation. Collective used to mean between employees and their unions, or and employees in their industries. Today it means that unions have to work much more on a productive manner with management to ensure that their employees have a job and their industry is competitive. Hope this gives you a perspective. It's a challenging time for unions, certainly one they can overcome. In fact, it's a better time for unions today than 100 years ago, when it really was so drastic of a need for unions to come into place. That need can still exist today. Unions have to find where that need is, and then they have to work with management to ensure that unions have the assets that they need to allow management to make a living so that employees can make a living as well. Enjoy the week, everybody.